Okay, so those are your common tools and techniques that you actually have. You're going to see those over and over again. Okay, so let's go look at the first process group. This is the definition. If I look at it by the process group, it's really part of section 2 in the standard. The actual processes, though, are each one going to be in individual sections in the PMBOK guide. 2 processes. Develop the project charter, which authorizes the project, and identifying the stakeholder. Identifying, classifying stakeholders. Very different from the standpoint that develop the project charter is done once. And it should be done very quickly after the project is started so that we get it over. We just say, hey, yes, we're starting, let's go. Whereas the identify stakeholders, you're going to be doing this all the way through. Identifying who new stakeholders are every time you do something. So section 4.1, this is chapter 4, section 1, talks about this first process, developing your project charter. Okay. This happens to be inside of integration, because this is the very first thing you do. Integration is going to be the first thing and the last thing, and then in between it's going to be just collecting everything from below it. So your project charter is a document that formally authorizes the existence of the project and provides the project manager with the authority to apply organizational resources to those activities. So that's the definition of this. This is the document that does that. This document should link between what you're doing and the strategic objectives of why you're doing this. Now, it may also, and I'm using the word may, it may actually say when you need to start this, and it may include some boundaries. Depends on the type of project it is. But this is really trying to say, yes, we're ready to do this. Formally authorizes the project, which is done by senior management, formally assigns the project manager. Now, this one is often misunderstood because in many cases, it's the project manager who creates this document. But you cannot authorize yourself to spend money, which is why you may create a draft of the document, but if you actually do it, it should be distributed from somebody in senior management that's going to give you the authorization to do this. Performed once or at predefined points in the project. Usually it's once, and it's usually done very soon because all it does is authorize the project and the project manager. That is the whole purpose of this. Anything beyond that becomes part of your scope. The charter, the plan, the scope, they're different things. You have a couple of inputs coming in here. You have 2 outputs. Okay? Your business documents and your agreements are going to help explain why you're doing this. What is the objective? Maybe some assumptions and constraints. Here is where you're going to create the project charter, and you're going to see this project charter used a lot of times in the next few processes. This is also the process where you create that assumption log. So I just put this in kind of as a little bit more of an understanding of where these things come from. And this refers to the practice guide, especially for business analysis. This is one of those that would not be a bad idea once you become a member of PMI to download this document. very readable. Don't worry about the second one, but the practice guide is very good, and it does explain all of this front end stuff. The needs assessment is why we're doing this. The business case then puts the justification together for it. Maybe there's a benefit management plan that goes along with this. This probably should have been a dotted line because it's not always there, but there is an assumption on the exam that you will have a business case. Somebody will have identified why this project should be done. You will create the project charter, and then you will move into the project management plan. One of those inputs that came in, we talked about this idea of an agreement. Agreements may be all sorts of different formats, but they're usually identifying some of the intentions, some of the framework, especially legal, that the project has to fit within. Your business case, as I said, this is identifying what the needs are, what was used to justify the investment in it, how it's going to align with the objectives, and maybe some of the cost-benefit analysis used to justify that actual project. Now, this is one of those areas that you kind of have to take just at a high level understanding. There are two situations or two parts to the business case. One has to do with why, which is the business need. And it also may say, why do we need this? What's the current situation? What do we need to do to fix it? Who are some of your key stakeholders that are affected? And maybe some idea of a potential scope. And then there's a lot of times a lot of additional analysis that may be done to help basically sell the fact that we need to do this, including some of the success factors, some of the root cause of the problem, even to the point of maybe recommending some additional options. What are the success factors, things like that. A lot depends on the organization, what's going to be there. Now, in addition to saying what is the situation and why do we need this, there a lot of times has to do with some financial measurements or benefit measurements that we use, because the portfolio management process has to select between different potential projects. Now, this is an area that I will admit project managers don't do this. This is given to you as part of your business case. It has been on the exam, though, since the second edition. And even though project managers don't do it, their understanding is you need to understand why your project was selected. And you need to understand a little bit more about some of the measurements that might be used. And I'll have to admit, these are on every PMI exam, whether it's Agile, business analysis, project, program, whatever. They love to ask these questions, and they are identical in the way they're asked. So, kind of just a review. If we have a payback period, this means what did we pay? What was the investment to do it? And how long is it going to take us to get our payback? When are we going to actually break even on the revenue coming in versus the money we spent? That is what's considered the payback period. Now, will you need to calculate it? Probably not. Will you need to take and answer questions such as, Project A had a payback period of 18 months. Project B had a payback period of 12 months. And Project C had a payback period of, say, 24 months. Which one should you select? The answer is very simple. Whatever the period is the shortest. So the less is the answer. The shorter period would be the project you would select. All they're trying to get at is, do you understand that the quicker you get your money back, the better it is? Okay, that's your payback period. Now, some of the other courses will have you try to calculate all these things as far as present value, future value, net present value. That's not on the exam. What happens is, when on the exam, they will give you this net present value for various potential projects, and they'll say, which one should you select? The answer's right here, whichever one has the largest. So let me show you what this is really about, even though I said you don't have to calculate it. But take the one we had before. This was our investment, our revenue, etc. The thing is that when you're in multi-years, we all know that even a year from now, $400 is not the same as it was that it is now. And actually, if I'm looking at a discount rate of 10%, there's a formula, but it basically comes out to you get about 90% after 1 year, just a little bit more than 80% the second year, a little bit more than 70% the third year. And therefore, what you do is you adjust these numbers and you add them all up. And that net present value is the sum of all of these numbers. Once again, it doesn't matter how you came up with that number. The fact is, if you're presented it, bigger is better. Whichever net present value is the largest is the project that you would select. It's on every exam, but it's really, that's all you have to know. Payback period is the shortest time. Net present value is the biggest one. Now, this discount rate also can come into effect because depending on what we have as far as that discount rate, what you're looking at is, how can I get this to be zero? What would be the rate I would have to have? First of all, you cannot calculate it. Your calculator on your exam is nowhere big enough to do that because it takes a lot of calculations. You need to know what that definition, though, of IRR, or internal rate of return, and that is the discount rate that would give you a net present value equal to zero. Okay. Now, on the exam, if I don't have to calculate it, I might need the definition, but most often they'll tell you that you have 3 or 4 projects and they'll give you what the internal rate of return is for each one and say, which one should I pick? Same thing, bigger is better. Payback period is the shortest. Net present value, internal rate of return is the largest. That's all you need to know for the exam. Now, in real life, why do you care? Because if they chose this project based on one of these factors, you need to look to see when you finish the project, are you going to be able to meet that? In other words, if there's a payback period of 2 years, am I really going to be able to keep my costs down enough where my revenue is going to help me get to that payback period of 2 years? That's why they want you to know it. But on the exam, it's more using it to determine which project you select. One of the other things that you need to understand is there is this thing called opportunity cost. And when they talk about the opportunity cost, it's going to be the net present value, most often, of the project you did not select. So if you said I had net present value, A had a net present value of something, and B and C and D, and I selected A, B, and D, what's the opportunity cost? It would be the net present value of C, the one you did not select. And that's all it is. See, opportunity cost is what opportunity did you miss by not selecting that particular project. Couple of other ones. I'm going to have you ignore the bottom two because I don't think, first of all, if they're on the exam, it's only one question. And I'm not sure unless you really know this and have been involved in it. It makes a whole lot of sense. I will make sure, though, that you understand return on investment, because this is another one that is on every single PMI exam. But before we look at that, let's look at this one first. Benefit cost ratio. Okay. You're at the very beginning of a project. Should not your benefits that you're going to receive as a result of doing this project be more than what it's going to cost you? Absolutely. So if it's benefit ratio to cost, benefit goes on the top and cost goes on the bottom. Beginning of the project, alphabetically, B comes before C. Okay. Because kind of guessing I'm going to do this later on a little different, but at the beginning, B over C, benefit before cost. Your ROI is that ratio, but instead of just being the pure benefits, they're taking out of it the cost, and it's the leftover benefits. And the ROI says, what am I going to get after I've taken my cost out compared to what it costs me to do? So that's where return on investment is the benefit minus the cost, or the net benefit divided by the cost. Okay. Wouldn't worry about these two. Depreciation, two different ways of depreciating. Straight line, meaning you take the same amount of depreciation every year. You could make it go faster, accelerate it by either taking more depreciation at the beginning or the end. And once again, those financial folks, they're the ones that make these decisions, not you. What may be on the exam, though, is you see this area down here between 0% and wherever that, especially on the purple line, that is what is called your sunk cost. Your salvage cost. Your salvage value, all right, start it again. The difference between the end of the depreciation and 0 is considered to be your salvage value. Think about your car. Even after you've depreciated it, not to mention driving it off the lot, but as you depreciate it over the year, it still has value. And that salvage value is what is the difference between once that depreciation is taken and going to 0. So it's always going to have some value, and that's considered your salvage value. And that, once again, is one of those questions that kind of is a simple one on the exam of what's salvage value. It's whatever's left over after you've done all your depreciation. The output from this is your project charter. Once again, authorizing, identifying the project manager, maybe some high-level information. Usually the project charter is a one-page document. Bullets, not a whole lot of words. The longer you take to write this, the closer it gets to become a scope statement, not a charter. So it could have how you're aligned, why you're doing this, bullets. What are your objectives, success criteria, bullets. High-level requirements, high-level projects, risk assumptions, constraints. Maybe a milestone schedule, if that's important. Maybe some key information financial, if that's important. My concern I have with these two is I want to make sure they're really valid, or whether somebody just pulls some numbers out of the air and didn't really do the analysis of what it was going to take. Some of the other things, but bottom line, who is the project manager and who's the sponsor? This is another one of those slides, just like with the constraints. I'm not sure exactly where this should go. When we talk about objectives on a project charter, they're not SMART. They're not specific. They're very seldom measurable. They're not assigned to individuals yet. They may not even be realistic. We'll get closer to that. And they may be timely, but in a lot of cases, that specific information will come later on. So this is one of those areas, and I heard it from somebody that took their exam like a week and a half ago, and she said, yeah, sure enough, it was on there. Said, what did the R in a SMART objective stand for? Okay, so this is just, once again, realistic, knowing what those words mean. My other output is my assumption log, and we talked about this before. This is one of those important documents where you're going to continually update it throughout the project. Tools and techniques, expert judgment. You have some data gathering, but you notice you have no data analysis or data representation yet. More interpersonal skills and meetings. Very common, expert judgment and meetings over and over again. Here, all I did was I pulled out what the PMBOK said about the expert judgment and who should be included. Maybe somebody that knows organizational strategy, benefit management, your technical knowledge of the industry and the focus area you're working in. Maybe looking at that duration and budget estimate, not necessarily coming up with the estimate, but looking at the estimate if you were given that to see maybe where you are. And starting right now to maybe identify some of the potential risks that we have with the project. Now, this is another one I pulled in here. Not so much that this is the only time you use it, because you're going to use it over and over again, but facilitating and getting interactive participation is what you're striving for. And this is one of those areas that it's hard when we're in an virtual environment like this, especially if people are going in and out all the time, to be able to get the conversation going. And I'm hoping tomorrow that maybe some of you will feel a little more comfortable to speak up and say things as we go through. But part of the reason too I put this in here is because there's a couple of things that I really question why they're here. Joint application design and development. Some of you may remember years ago when we actually did this. We don't call it JAD anymore. We don't even call it RAD, Rapid Application Development. We basically call it Agile. That's what really Agile, where it started years ago, where we put a bunch of people in a room and we gave them a week to come up with something. Just not necessarily a term we use that much anymore. Your quality function deployment, once again, is something that I don't see used very often. But this is the first place that the PMBOK guide talks about a user story. And a user story is basically a way to write a requirement. Now, what they're saying is you can develop these through facilitation. You can develop these anyway, anytime, by whomever. But this is the first time the PMBOK really identifies what a user story is. And the user story has three things. As a stakeholder, in other words, who this pertains to, what do you need to accomplish, and the benefit or why. Okay. So this as a stakeholder is actually what we call a persona. And a persona, if I go back to my example where I was trying to select a seat on the airplane, the process in here is that I want to be able to select a seat on the airplane so that I have it ahead of time and I can plan on my carry-on luggage or whatever I say as to why I want to do that. except if I'm on Southwest, we don't. Instead, we don't select a seat, we select a boarding group, or we try to. But as a stakeholder or persona, the difference is because I fly a lot, different rules apply as to what seats I can select, as opposed to somebody else. And it may be based on my status. It may be based on the price I pay for the ticket. It may be based on all sorts of different things. And this, as a stakeholder, or as they call it, a persona, allows me to identify that I have more than one way to do something. So when we start talking about user stories, we talk about requirements, we talk about things we need to do as part of the scope. If I'm using more of an agile technique or approach, we will be writing these most often as a user story. Sometimes I don't understand the why, and it's maybe not that important on very small things, but I think this persona has added a lot to it. Okay. This is an area that, you know, really kind of adds to that requirement, especially because it tells you you may have more than one. Okay. This fell into this area under facilitation. I'm surprised that they didn't put it someplace else, but you know, it is what it is. Okay, so the first process. So we have 1 out of 49 done. So if I were doing a burn down chart in agile terms, I got 1 out of the 49 done. Developing that project charter. Very first thing that's done, very quickly done, high level, getting you authorization to get going. Okay. A lot of times it will be distributed as part of a kickoff meeting. Maybe not written, but maybe it's the verbal distribution of that information as a kickoff meeting. The second process in initiating is identifying the stakeholders. This is in section 13-1 or 13.1 because it is down at the bottom. Once again, because of the fact that it was added to the PMBOK guide last. The only reason that it's there at the bottom is because they didn't want to renumber the book. Okay, but this is the second thing, and actually it's done at the same time, because when you start identifying the stakeholders, some of them may have already been identified and they were given to you as part of that business case or whatever. They were the people that came up with the need for this, or they were the people that helped put together that business case. Those are key stakeholders. But you're going to find that you're going to need so many more people to talk to and work with as you go through. Not only do you identify who they are, but you are going to understand how you're going to engage with them. In other words, how am I actually going to go through and understand how best to work as we go through. Inputs, outputs. Got a whole bunch more things here. Now, let me show you something, because this is where things get confusing. We just started our project. We just did our charter. We're starting to identify our stakeholders, and yet 2 of the documents that are coming in here, we have not created yet. What does this mean? What this means is this process is done over and over again. The first time, no, you will not have these documents. The first time, you will not update these documents. But when you come back and do it the second time and the third time, on and on, you will start to pull additional documents in. Okay? And sometimes those documents are going to help you identify new stakeholders. To start out with, though, first time in here, all you have is your project charter, which you created from the previous process, and your business documents that are coming in that might identify the type of stakeholders you would have. Your agreements, same as your business documents. Maybe your agreements talk about contract officers or key people that you have to interface with. Those could be part of the agreement. Could be people, it could be groups of people. Here is the first time we're now going to see the EEFs and OPAs coming in. Now, I want you to look at these later on as you go through, because I want you to see when do you have both and when do you only have one of them. My output is my stakeholder register we just briefly talked about before, and potentially change requests already. Partly because if I add a stakeholder, that may change my scope, it may change my schedule, it may change my budget. So those areas, once again, even at the very beginning, I could have those two. This whole number 3 and 4 here, as far as your project management plan, your project documents, and the updates to those, they're not there the first time. And as we go through all of the planning process, you're going to have the same thing. First time through, we don't have it. After that, we will. So before I go any farther, I'm going to suggest, as you go through and study, remember I made the comment that I think you should have some cards that you can kind of recreate page 25 there. You know, have 5 cards where you have the process groups and lay them out in order. Have your 10 knowledge areas, don't lay them out in order, randomly put them. And then start to create a card for each one of these processes. And I would say put the name on the front of the card, and on the back of it, put your inputs and your outputs. Now, I would not drop it down. I would say project charter, business documents. You know, I probably would even put the agreements up here. The only reason why I do it this way is because I want to keep it consistent with the PMBOK guide. But you have your charter, you have your business documents, you have your agreements, you have your EEFs and OPAs, and later on you'll have these updates. That's on one side of the back of the card. The other side is your stakeholder register, your change request, your updates to PM plans, and your updates to your documents. Don't drop them down here, okay? As you're studying, don't worry about the dropping it down. I did this only because, once again, I'm trying to have you remember what a business document has in it, and somewhat of an idea already. You do have an assumption log, which would have been coming in here. You haven't done an issue log or a risk register yet, but there's a good chance that you'd be updating them. So I wouldn't worry about dropping these down. And I've debated back and forth as I put this material together whether I really wanted all that detail in there. But you need to be able to do this, because one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is take that card for identify stakeholders and figure out where it goes in your chart. So you're in effect doing almost like a game board. You put the process groups, you put the knowledge areas, and then as you pick up a game piece or a process, where does it go? Which one of those interfaces where in that cell between the column and the row? My register itself, we talked about this before. This is information about the stakeholder. Tools and techniques, I did bring a little bit more down as far as the expert judgment, because this is, once again, understanding what's going on within the organization, the culture, maybe the customers, the industry, maybe some of the key team members. Okay, stop real quick. I need to make the point. When you see politics or political environment, they are talking about internal to the company, not what's going on in our day and age right now. Okay, when they talk about the politics and power struggles, they're talking about how this goes on within the organization. So kind of critical to know. Data gathering, kind of anything. Data analysis, data representation. Now, the other thing that I'm doing here, and it's more for me and for other instructors, as well as for you, if I have it bold, that is because there is an upcoming slide that talks about this. So I have an upcoming slide on analysis and representation. I don't on data gathering, because how you gather the data to figure out who your stakeholders are, it's anything that makes sense to you. Nobody really has to say the way you should do that. The data analysis has two key areas. One is looking at previous documents, historical information, or whatever. Stakeholder analysis is really where we're going to spend more time. And this is going to be something that, as you know more about the stakeholder, you're going to make changes to this. The representation, we have a couple of specific ways of showing this information. We have what are called classification models. We have a Stakeholder Cube. We have a Salience Model. We have directions of influence, and we have prioritization. Now, what's interesting is this chart used to be in the PMP guide, and I don't know why it's not. It is in the business analysis, it is in the risk management, it is in the program, it's in the portfolio. It's every place except in the PMP guide. And yet it is one of the ones that you will be tested on. And what it really is saying, rather than using people's names, and you never ever do that, mainly because whoever is represented by A probably doesn't think they're that low in power. They probably think they're more powerful. So this is not something you would show them either. But the idea is you're going to map what their interest is in the project to what their power is. Because what that's going to do is that's going to tell you how to communicate with them, how to engage with them. Okay. So let's take this one down here. They don't have a whole lot of interest in the project, and they don't have a whole lot of power. So do I really care? Only because I need to make sure that G doesn't move up or D doesn't move farther over. So I monitor them to see if there's a change in either their power or their interest, because if that changes, I'll have to engage differently with them. Okay, you have somebody up in this top left-hand quadrant. Okay? They don't care a whole lot about the project, but they have a lot of power. The idea is keep them satisfied, meaning figure out how much they really want to know. And this is a good example where, if I go back to my text messaging, TMI, too much information. If I provide too much information to these people, they may unsubscribe, and I won't ever be able to get back with them. So I need to understand what is going on here. I need to understand how much they want, how much they need, and I need to monitor them. Now, high interest, high power. Okay, we need to manage those people very closely. They're the ones that probably will have a lot to say of how we're working. They're usually higher management, etc. But you need to understand, you need to work with them, figuring out what you need. This one to me is the interesting quadrant. And actually, personally, I spend more time with people that are in this high interest but low power. That's because those are the people that are going to be affected by what we're doing. They're interested in the project mainly because it probably affects them directly. They don't have a lot of power, but they know what's going on. These are your people that are working out there on the line. And if you're going to be modifying that assembly line, the workers on the line would be down in this quadrant. They're going to tell you what's going on. They're going to be concerned about the changes that are being made. And they're going to give you a lot of feedback. They can either be very positive or they can be very negative. And they probably have more impact on your project than any of the rest of these. So that's one of the reasons why I need to understand who they are, and I need to understand how to keep them informed of what's going on. Now, this particular one I show you has to do with interest and power. I could also have one that has to do with power and influence. And I could have one that has to do with what kind of impact they might have based on what kind of influence they have. So the quadrants are the same, the usage is the same, you're just looking at it different points of view. Okay, I would definitely make sure I understand what those 4 quadrants stand for, because they're the same regardless which grid we use. Your stakeholder cube, all it really is doing is it's taking this and it's putting all 3 of those together and putting them into a cube. So you can see their power interest, their power influence, their impact influence, 3-dimensional. Unfortunately, I'm not a 3-dimensional person. And in fact, when I had to do, as a math major, when I had to get into 3-dimensional graphs, I really struggled. I've never done 3 dimensions as much. So I'm perfectly content to having 3 2-dimensional models, but that's just me. But the idea is understanding these stakeholders from different points of view. And the whole reason for this is you want to understand how to communicate or how to engage with different people. Your Salience model, this one looks at your stakeholders just a little differently. And actually, I really like this one for a couple of reasons. First of all, if I'm in an agile project and I've been assigned a product owner, somebody from the business who's supposed to work with me and give me my requirements, I look at this legitimacy and say, are you the right person? Are you the one that knows what's going on? Are you the one that knows where we're trying to go? Are you the one that can make decisions? That's what I'm looking at when I'm looking at some of these stakeholders. Maybe they know what's going on, but they're not real sure they want to change. And maybe they can't make decisions and I'm going to have to find somebody else. Power is the same. Urgency, though, I didn't think urgency was too important until I had a project. And you'll appreciate, because you're around casinos and understand, sometimes we have to do work within the casino. We do it at night, making sure that it's back up and everything's running in the morning. I had one project where I was converting things, and I specifically said, don't do any marketing the next day in case something, just, I don't want extra people in case something happens. But anyway, so we started our conversion of the software. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I realized things weren't working. We were not going to get that casino up at 9 a.m. like we wanted to. Thank goodness I had identified ahead of time different stakeholders, and I knew which stakeholder call to say, I don't know what's happening, but I know it's not good. Other stakeholders, we knew, we didn't contact them until we knew more about what was going on. That urgency helps you understand when you contact people based on different situations. Do you wait till you understand what happened to tell them? So if you have an issue log, after you've closed the issue and you've resolved the problem, then you let them know that, hey, we had this problem, but we fixed it, no big deal. That's where I look at this, especially when I get into a whole bunch of stakeholders. What their power is, what kind of urgency I need to have as far as engaging and communicating, letting them know what's going on, and then What is their legitimacy? In other words, what do they bring to the table? Do they bring knowledge? Do they bring vision? Do they bring decision making as we go through? Very powerful way of modeling these stakeholders. Direction of influence is something they added, and it really is saying you're going to take a particular person and you're going to see who they are connected to or who they have relationships with upper management, maybe how they work with other team members, maybe sideways, outward in other outside representatives. So for instance, you have a stakeholder that's very knowledgeable and has contacts at the regulatory. That would be one of those areas that I would want to look at. Prioritization, I have to admit, this is not something I liked when I saw it. And I still don't kind of like the idea I'm prioritizing stakeholders, but I do. I have to. If I have a whole bunch of stakeholders, I need to understand how they work together and kind of where do I need to spend my time. But like I said, it's not always that top quadrant of the person who's the most important. Maybe it's down in that somebody who doesn't have a lot of power, but they have a lot of interest. So that whole grid also could be something I would use when I start talking about prioritization. In the exam content outline, if you go out to pmi.org, and let me see if I can actually do it. I got all sorts of stuff up here going right now. So let me open up a new browser. Doesn't have all that stuff. PMI.org. What I want you to do is I want you to go out here and I want you to go under your certifications and I want you to look at certification types, project management professional, and I want you to go over here to the current PMP exam content outline. This is what it looks like, okay? And the reason I say this is because what I want you to look at is this. This is how the exam is based. It has these domains. We just finished the first one, which was initiating. You also have some knowledge and skills associated with it. Now, I've kind of tried to, in the slide that I just had up, tried to put those together. But let's look at initiating. Okay, initiating, first of all, is 13% of the exam. Not very much. Closing's a little bit less, but 13. Most of your exam is going to cover the processes in the middle here. Okay, so this is what they're saying as far as the exam. As far as initiating. This is the domain. These are the various tasks. All of the questions that would pertain to initiating will be mapped back to these tasks. So this says perform project assessment based on available information, lessons learned and meetings to support the evaluation of the feasibility within given assumptions and or constraints. So this is really saying way up front, I need to understand kind of what the feasibility of this project is. What are some of your key deliverables based on business requirements? Perform stakeholder analysis using appropriate tools and techniques. Okay, right there, we just did that. We talked about the Salience Model. We talked about those grids. Those questions would be in here. Okay. High-level assumptions, all of these in order to propose an implementation strategy. This is all the stuff that is coming from the high level off of the business case into going into how you might do this. Participate in the development of the business charter. Sorry about that. By compiling and analyzing information to ensure project stakeholders are in agreement on the elements. participate in the development of the charter. Obtain a charter approval from the sponsor in order to formalize the authority assigned to the project manager and gain commitment and acceptance for the project. Conduct benefit analysis to validate the project alignment. So this gets back to understanding that benefit to cost ratio and understanding what those benefits are and making sure those are still viable. Inform stakeholders of the approved charter with key understanding of key deliverables, milestones, roles, and responsibilities. That would be if you have a little bit more thorough project charter with all that information. So then you have, in addition, it's saying these are the knowledge and skills that you need for this domain. Analytical skills, very general. Benefit analysis techniques. Okay, this goes back to those we talked about as far as net present value, IRR, things like that. What are the elements of a charter? That one page that talked about the business aspect and then the justification. Estimating tools and techniques at a super high level here, just to kind of say, how big is this? And if they gave you 1.2 million, do you think that's going to be enough, or depending on what you're looking at? And then understanding what strategic management is. Now, it says in addition to these, there are some cross-cutting knowledge and skills. And let me scoot down to these. I hate doing this while you're looking at it so you don't get car sick as I'm going through this. Okay, these are considered the cross-cutting skills. And what they mean by this is these are things that are used in multiple domains. Brainstorming techniques, business acumen. Remember, I made the comment we need to understand about the organization, what is the business they're in. Change management techniques, coaching, mentoring, training, all of these various areas that could be used in multiple domains. So as you're studying for the exam, part of what you want to do is you want to go through this list and understand what each thing is about, and kind of in your mind say, where would I use that? Where would that come into play on these different processes? These are not specific to each one of those. These are just in general because they're ideas. This is used on multiple things. But this document is something that you need to follow through with because regardless, here's the one for closing. There's 7 tasks here, and then there are a number of knowledge and skills that are specific to this. So as you're studying, you need to continue to look back to this because, as I said, all of your questions are going to map back to a particular task. And I haven't written the PMP questions. I've written some of the PGMP, program management questions. And what you have to do is literally take that and the Bloom's taxonomy as to how those things are written, but you have to identify what different types of questions might make sense to support this task. Now, when you get your results back on your exam, what's going to happen is they are going to take it and they're going to say, for, in this case, it was closing task 7. It's not going to show you how many questions you had and how many you answered right or how many you answered wrong. It's basically going to say needs improvement, below target, target, or above. And you have no idea what that means, and neither do I. All I know is that if you get too many needs improvement, you're probably not going to pass. Now, once again, I could do much poorer on this domain because it's only 7%. So initiating and closing are a very small percent on the exam, whereas the planning executing, monitoring, control, and especially executing and monitoring control, that's where you have to make sure that you're there. So Daniel, when you were talking about the fact of some of the later on information, a lot of that is executing and monitoring, controlling. And those are the areas where pretty heavy on the exam. Okay. So how about if we go back and take a look at these questions, and then we'll go through these and spend a little bit more time on them this time for you. I appreciate that feedback. And then we'll look at these answers. Okay. Sharon's a project manager in charge of an online banking project. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. This is very typical. They will give you something like this, and basically, who cares? I don't care whether it's Sharon or whether it's John, and I don't care whether they're doing an online banking project or whether they're trying to build new houses. It doesn't matter. They're trying to put it into a situation. But that doesn't tell me anything about it. Now, the project has completed the first phase and moving into the next phase. So remember, this is where you're going to use that picture. Here's a phase, and there's that little diamond that we had some sort of review before we went to the next phase. Which process must be carried out first before the next phase can begin? Which one do you do as soon as you start the next phase? See if I can go back and find that chart. This is the chart I'm looking at. So far, C is not right and neither is D. Okay, let me explain. When it talks about a phase, you see this little arrow? It says all of these things would be done in this phase. All of these process groups are going to be done in the next phase. So if I look at all of these things when I start this next phase, first thing you would do, you don't develop a charter, because I said it was only one time. But what else is in the initiating process? Michael, you got it right. The idea is identify stakeholders. Okay. Now, this is where, once again, the problem is this term of phase. When you are doing all of these process groups, all of these knowledge areas, and all of these 49 processes, if you have phases and you move from one phase to the next, you will end up doing all of these again in the next phase, except you do not create the project charter a second time. First thing we do when we move in, whether it's a new phase or a new project, we have to identify the stakeholders that would be associated with this new phase. Once we've done that, then we will look at our planning processes or our project management plan that go with that phase. So this is really a tricky one in the fact that I'm not going to worry about the charter when I go to the next phase. We should still be doing the same project, which is what the charter is. You identify, once you move into a new phase, you identify the stakeholders that may need to be added to this phase. I'm not sure we ever take stakeholders off, but we may just engage with them differently, because maybe phase one was R&D and we had certain R&D stakeholders very involved. We don't take them off, but I don't probably spend as much time when I get into the actual production environment. So take this, and instead of saying started, etc., which it's a very poor list. This really should say R&D. This phase here should probably be maybe the analysis of how you're going to actually do it, maybe the design, maybe the implementation. Okay. So does that make sense? Identifying stakeholders is the first thing you're going to do whenever you go to a new phase. After you do that and identify those stakeholders, then you will develop the project management plan, your schedule, your budget for that next phase, probably mostly your schedule. Your scope may not be that critical. If anything, it would be the schedule part of your plan. Does that make sense? This is somewhat of a trick question, but it's very typical. Okay, we can come back to that again later, but the key word there is that phase. And I don't like this diagram because those usually are not the phases of a project. It's usually more analysis, design, things like that. Okay, number 2, the project manager calls you in as a consultant to provide input on developing the charter. According to the PMBOK guide, what would you basically be providing? Your contribution would be best termed as PMBOK guide terminology, which should tell you there's only one term there that we talked about in the PMBOK guide, expert judgment. Okay. We never talked about professional consultant. We never talked about a charter consultant. We never talked about an expert consultancy. The only thing, according to the PMBOK guide, what you are contributing to is the expert judgment. Number 3, which is not an EEF. Okay, so before we start out, what is an EEF? An EEF is something that comes in externally. So which one would not be an EEF? Where are you getting your organizational infrastructure from? The project? You're getting it from the organization itself. That is an EEF that is coming internal to your organization, but external to the project. Government standards are coming external to your organization. They're coming from the government. Marketplace conditions are coming from external information. Those are all 3 EEFs. The scope statement is pure project. OPAs have to do specifically with your project. EEFs are things that are around, either within the organization, very closely tied to your project, or greater out there. So the answer to that is A. I'm going to review these EEFs and OPAs a little bit more as we go through, because we need to understand what is an EEF and what is an OPA. And I think if we remember that chart, remember I told you to look at that chart. Okay, remember this chart right here? Whoops, went too far. EEFs are external to your organization, like from the government, regulations, regulatory agencies. They can also be external to your project, but internal to the organization. So these would be constraints, these would be rules, these would be things like the infrastructure for that organization. That is internal EEF. These are external EEFs. OPAs. First of all, think OPAs as being templates. That scope statement is a template that you probably are given to fill in. That is where those policies, procedures, practices, templates come in on this side of the OPAs. And your historical information is also considered to be an asset to the organization, to the project that you can use. OPAs stand for assets, organizational process assets, whether they're policies, procedures, templates, whatever. Historical information, those are assets to the organization that you would use. It would be okay, Daniel, you're right. Organizational infrastructure is considered a policy or procedure, but it's external to your project. If it's internal to the organization, but it's external to your project. If I had, for instance, let's say I've been told what kind of communications or what kind of sign-offs I need for my project, that would be the policy or procedure for the project. But at the higher level, that infrastructure, it's internal to your organization, but it's external to your project. OPAs are inside your project. Make sense? Okay. We'll keep going through these because, once again, this is one of those areas that is very confusing. But because they're talked about so much and they're going to show up over and over again, maybe what we will look at a little bit more tomorrow on those actual pieces of it. Okay, next one. The project charter formally authorizes the project. Who should issue? Who should issue the project charter? Not who should write it, but who should issue it. Anybody foresee? Got all the other answers so far, A, B, and D. Okay, let's go through this a second. The project charter does two things. It identifies and authorizes the project, and it authorizes the project manager to spend money. So because of that, it needs to be issued by somebody who can authorize that project manager to spend the money, meaning it cannot be the project manager. Nobody decided it was the user of the project. So now I'm between the sponsor and the functional manager. Okay, let's go back and talk about what the functional manager is. A functional manager is either there because I'm in a functional organization, and if I'm in a functional organization, I probably don't even have a project manager. A functional manager could also have been called a resource manager, meaning that is the manager of the people that are on my team. They would not be there. The charter is always going to be issued by either the sponsor or some senior person. Sponsor most likely because the sponsor is going to pay for this. And they are ultimately responsible. They're accountable, I should say. The sponsor is accountable for that. So the answer should be B. Make sense? It can't be the user. It can't be the project manager. It's between the sponsor and the functional manager. If you look at the concept of a functional manager, the functional manager, you're either in a functional organization, and they wouldn't have to do this because there's no project manager in a pure functional organization, or if this functional manager is the manager of your resources, you work with them to get your resources, but it's the sponsor who's responsible for putting out that charter. Now, let me stop a second and tell you and admit, I've only had 2 projects where I've ever done a project charter, truthfully. One I did because the sponsor had just assumed that position. The project had been approved early on, but he wasn't in that position at the time. And I wanted to make sure he knows you're paying for this. And so therefore I actually did the charter. I drafted one. I had a discussion with him and I said, here, you're paying for it. You're the one that has to distribute them. You don't use them at Panasonic either. Most people don't. Because if the real purpose of this is to authorize the project manager and get the project kicked off, I don't think we need to create a document for that. One of the organizations I work with in Northern California, they actually do the kickoff twice. They do the project charter for the business to say, okay, you've been asking for this for a while. We're just letting you know that we're actually starting it. So they do a charter, but it's very high level. It's actually not usually written either. It's just a kickoff meeting. The problem that happens if you get too far into it, you're getting into a scope statement, and that's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to kick this thing off. So yes, I don't see it very often. I did one other only because it was a touchy project that I knew we didn't have a whole lot of support behind it, except at a high management level. So I did have the sponsor work. I worked with the sponsor. We created the charter, very tight what this was at a super high level, and had him do the kickoff meeting to basically make sure people understood. But you're right, I don't see it happen very often. But for your exam, yep, they're going to assume that you do it. Sarah has just started identifying stakeholders. She's looking for a template for the stakeholder register so she doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. Where would she find a template? I talked about this just a few minutes ago. Templates are specific project management policies, procedures. Those are specific OPAs. So think of that when you're talking about previous project documentation. Okay, yeah, that's where she could find one if she'd done it before, but it's not as good an answer. Your project management plan is not the stakeholder register. They really don't have much to do with each other. And it's not an EEF because I don't think that the organization, Panasonic says this is the way you're going to identify all your stakeholders. If it were a policy that was for everybody, that you would always have to do something, a good example of another another EEF that's internal to the organization would be how you go about doing purchasing. The procedures anybody uses, whether they're on a project or not, that is a policy and procedure that is at an organizational level, and it would be part of what we would talk about as an EEF. It's beyond the project, but it's still within the company. Okay, so number 6, once you obtain the charter, the project manager immediately starts acquiring the project resources. Is this correct according to the PMBOK guide? Now, I'll have to admit, we haven't really talked about this, but if you were to go back and look at page 25, which I'll see if I can find without killing your eyes as I'm flying through this. We have a process here called acquire resources. It is part of executing. It is not, you don't, according to the PMBOK guide. Now, this gets really confusing because the fact that in many organizations you do end up having D is actually the right answer. Okay. The acquisition of your project resources is meant to be a executing process activity, not immediately after you identify them. And, once you've got your charter, you've got a whole set of planning that has to be done. And especially in the resource, you have to plan what kind of resources you need. You have to estimate, you have to plan how you're going to get them, all of those things. So they make a big deal about until you've kind of done your planning, you don't get the resources. Now, let me confuse things a little bit only from the standpoint that if I'm in an agile type of project, we don't do it the same way. Because if I'm doing an agile project, I form my team and then the team does the planning, not just a few people. Well, it's a little different, but according to the PMBOK guide, you wait till after at least some planning has been done before you start to acquire the actual team members. So acquisition is really an executing process. Now, do they need to start considering? But that isn't what it says. This says acquiring. So the fact of immediately acquiring is wrong. They should consider it, but they shouldn't acquire yet. And it's not the project sponsor's responsibility totally to provide those project resources. Now, in some instances, yes, project sponsor will help tell you who you are. This is very much dependent on how your project is being done, okay? But regardless, you don't do it immediately. Make sense? Okay, number 7. You need to replace the legacy manufacturing system with a modern software application to reduce delivery delays and process downtime. Okay, that's okay, but I'm not real sure it really matters. Your IT director anticipates a project to fulfill this business need. However, he warns you that the new project budget cannot exceed $75,000 due to shortages in the department budget. He also indicates that no additional staff will be allocated to this project other than the existing IT staff. Probably sounds somewhat familiar to some of you. If you're assigned, how would you document these? Are these assumptions? Are they restrictions? Are they constraints? Are they conditions? He warns that the new budget cannot exceed and no additional staff will be allocated. Daniel, they go a little bit farther than that. Now, the second part may be an assumption, but I think the first part is definitely, Michael, you're right, definitely a constraint. Whenever it says you cannot exceed, that is a constraint. That's not an assumption. Now, the assumption was that if I had said that the assumption would be that it would be fully staffed with existing IT staff, no, we don't really talk about a condition, okay? Project conditions is not really a term in PMP, okay? In PMP, we tend to have assumptions or constraints. Those are the two terms we use. This gets back to PMP terminology. And this is where sometimes how things are done in your organization are going to be kind of confusing. But yeah, when you have something like this, it's either going to be an assumption that something's going to be done, or it's going to be a constraint. Now, the first one definitely is a constraint. The second one is, it could be considered an assumption, but it's still negative. No additional staff will be allocated. So that's really where it comes out as a constraint. So you had the right answer. C is the correct answer. But really, when we talk about project management, things like this, it's either going to be an assumption that we believe it's true, or it's a constraint that's going to cause things to have to work within that constraint. Okay, number 8. Okay, this would be a matter of going back to that input and output you have for the develop project charter process. Okay, says which one is neither an input nor an output. So is project charter, that's an output, right? Professional and technical associations. Let me explain this one because this is pretty typical too. They're talking about an input or an output. This is more a tool and technique. So when they talk about inputs or outputs, go look for, did they give you something that was not either a tool or technique? Is the business case an input? Yes. Is the assumption log an output? Yes. So the answer there would be professional and technical association. This one, they might actually spend a little bit more time looking at the inputs and outputs of this one because it's that critical. This is the beginning. You have business documents and agreements coming in that help you understand what decisions has been made, why you start this project. You create the project charter, the assumption log. And here we're starting to see the EEFs and OPAs show up. Number 9, project charter that formally authorized the project was created. The project charter documented initial requirements, satisfy the needs and expectations. How often should the charter be revised? Nobody should miss this one. I think I've said it at least 5 times. Usually never. Okay. Think about this. If you did a charter, all it's doing is saying we're getting ready to start this and you've been assigned. Why would I have to go back and change that? You're past that point. Once you've got the project started, you're looking at the scope. This says they document those initial requirements. I hope they did them just at a super high level because there really isn't any need to have those in there except at a super high level just to kind of put a understanding around it. Okay, last one. Stakeholder analysis is an important technique. One of the steps involved is to identify the potential impact of each stakeholder and classify them appropriately. Which one is not a valid model for that purpose? Which one did we not talk about as far as stakeholder model? The tolerance model. Actually, there is no such thing as a tolerance model. When you classify stakeholders, you can use either a salience model, a power interest grid, an influence input grid, any of those. Tolerance model is not a valid. That's one of the things that you're going to have to look at as you're going through the test questions. You need to look for things, just like going back up here when we talked about the conditions. Conditions is not a term we use. Okay, so anyway, that gets us through the first domain, first process group. What we'll do tomorrow is we will start working through the project management plans, the 13 of them, and see how we can try to understand those. So any last comments before everybody runs? Because I'm sure you probably have other things to do. Answer for number 10 was B, the tolerance model. There is no such thing as a tolerance model.